my intention for this time together is, as I said, going to be unrehearsed and raw conversations and case studies of real, vulnerable sharing between us all about these things that we often don't talk about, right? These extraordinary experiences that who are we going to tell? Are people going to think we're crazy, right? We're not supposed to tell. Even in my tradition that I grew up out of and climbed the monastery walls out of, my lineage, which I stand on proudly, we're not supposed to talk about spiritual experiences. You're supposed to keep it very quiet and hidden. And I'd like to blow that out of the water a bit. I'd like to invite us all to share with each other and learn from each other what these experiences are and how we can make meaning of them. So a few to warm us up. When I was 7 years old, that's my first recall of something that I would call an extraordinary or spiritual experience. I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area, and my mother's boyfriend at the time decided that we were going to go on a hike around Mirror Lake in Yosemite. Now, if you know the area, this is about 3.5 hours away, 4 hours. And I remember it was kind of middle of the day already, but he decided we were going to go on a hike. And so we got in the car and drove to Mirror Lake. And long story short, we got, as you can imagine, about halfway around the lake, and it got dark. And said boyfriend did not have flashlight. Mother did not have flashlight. This is way before cell phones. And as I recall it, there was fear in the adults. They couldn't see, weren't sure how to get out. And I remember so clearly still looking up at now, the memory is these misty trees getting very dark. And suddenly the trees were speaking to me. The forest was holding me. And if I listened deeply to the whispers, I knew I could get us out. I could find the way out. And that's what I proceeded to do. And that became part of the myth of my family, is that I could get us out. I could listen to the whispers and tap into something and lead the way out. But what's interesting is, at this stage of development, what we're aware of are concrete objects. We're aware of the trees and the forest and nature. At 7 years old, I don't have metacognition yet. I can't look at my thoughts yet. And yet, the objects that are available to me were infused purely with conscious spirit. And for the first time in my recall, I felt held. I felt held by nature. I felt held by the forest. And I felt seen, and that I wasn't alone. The next big spiritual experience that I can recall, flash forward a few years, maybe 10 or 11. And this is a stage of development. We're now in, conventional stage of development, second person perspective. What's really important to us at this stage, who we are, is our peers. We really want our peers to see us in a certain way and connect with us and our community. And I went to a Christian horse camp for summer. And I remember it was the first time we would read the Bible. I went to Catholic school, but we didn't read the Bible much in Catholic school. It was a Christian horse camp, and we read the Bible, and I was delighted. Scholarship and study, and studying spiritual things, and studying ethics and goodness and love and Jesus's words. And at this camp, I remember it was a horse camp, and I was a good horsewoman, so I had my confidence. But I was kind of a sad little girl on the inside, too. There was challenges at home. But the kids saw me as a spiritual teacher. They saw me somehow. They wouldn't use those words, right? But I remember being reflected from my peers as somehow wise and having insight and having ethics and being kind. And this set the seed for me in two very important ways. One is, I believe, by being seen that way. Of course, I ended up, at a very crucial time in my development, I ended up becoming a teacher and a spiritual teacher in many ways. And that was important. But the spiritual experience side of this, the first is the developmental side. The experiential side happened after I got back from camp. After being seen that way, I felt in my body and in my breath, I could breathe deeply, connect to I felt like it was my soul, and feel what I called the Holy Spirit. That was the language I had being a Catholic schoolgirl, the Holy Spirit. But everybody, I felt this connection again of not being alone and having this capacity to tap into something else. It was like this other reality that was right there. Now, this lasted for a while, and then the capacity seemed to go away as I didn't keep up with it and didn't practice it, but it was there. The next spiritual experience I think I would say is relevant was when I went to university and went to college and fell in love. Now, ironically, is falling in love a spiritual experience? I don't know. What do you think? You can tell me. We could certainly argue it is. Right? But what was happening developmentally is I was actually growing into third-person perspective, we would say, or early modernism. My cognitive consciousness was beginning to be able to think about my thinking and think about my feeling and feel about my behavior and look at myself in a whole new way. It's the beginning of really the subtle self growing. And so in some ways, I was jumping into academia, jumping into achievership, doing the things that I was supposed to do, including falling in love. So I wasn't feeling the Holy Spirit. The trees weren't talking to me anymore, but I was deeply, deeply in love. And I knew somehow that was my highest thing and the most ultimate thing. That lasted for some years and was my practice and was my spiritual experience. And then, as these things do, crisis and transformation. As I grew out of what we might say orange modernism, I don't use the colors as much, out of third-person perspective and started to grow into postmodern awareness, fourth-person perspective, something shifted, and the things that satisfied me no longer did. It's a story very common to all of us. It was the beginning of what in spirituality and in my tradition we call renunciation. I had the fancy job. I'd done the achiever thing. I had the job. I had the boyfriend. I had the apartment. But looking back, the choices I was making weren't bringing me happiness, and I knew it. I had that deep loss inside. I'd lost my religion in many ways, if I'd ever had it. At the time, the words I was using to describe how I was feeling was I'd lost my inner compass. That all of the achieving and paying the bills and student loans, and that it wasn't satisfying. And one day in Boston, in a sunny, beautiful apartment, I was in such despair over that lack of inner compass and that lack of meaning and that lack of spirituality, that from that despair and from that asking, I had perhaps, certainly at the time, the biggest spiritual extraordinary experience that changed everything for me and also changed nothing. In some ways, we have permanent adaptations. In other ways, we do not. Waking up doesn't necessarily grow us up, which many of the listeners well know by now. It was a big waking up process, and I did leave my body. I had an experience of unification with luminosity, what in the tradition we call clear light. It was exceedingly blissful, and is a story unto its own. What's important, though, is coming back out, down into my body and sitting up. A series of insights started to flood through me, very much like popcorn. And some of them were precognitive. I had a sense of how I would spend the rest of my life. And I had a deep connection, once again, after years of it feeling missing, to not being alone, to having this invisible support and help that as soon as I try and quantify it, I lose it. It's like a slippery pig. As soon as you try and define it. But I can tell you wholeheartedly, honestly, it's beings. It's this, is it me? Is it my higher self? Is it you? Is it all of us? Is it angels? Is it God? Yes, 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 and no, no, no. It could be any of those things. But the functionality of it was I felt from that experience, I was able to go into a state of connection and meditation instantly after that. I was able to maintain going back into the clear light fairly easily and getting guidance and support for big life decisions, which is very pragmatic, right? I mean, the truth of these spiritual experiences is we want them to help us be better humans. An experience itself, if it doesn't grow us up, open our hearts, humble us in some beautiful way. And I will say again and again, if it doesn't lead to bodhicitta, which means means many things, but it means an open, loving heart for yourself and all beings, for all of your parts and all beings. If these experiences don't lead us to ethics, then I assert, and will, put my stake in the sand for this, that there's something off.